Thank you for joining us today for this presentation. Is it time to retire your fax servers? Over the next 30 minutes, we'll give you some food for thought to help you answer this question for yourself. My name's Tim Dubes. I'm the Senior Marketing Manager with eFax Corporate, who is sponsoring this presentation. I can also reluctantly report that I'm a grizzled veteran of the document capture and business process automation market. Over my 25 years in the industry, I've seen a number of technology shifts that I'd like to relate to you today. You know, in sports and business and really all areas of life, skills diminish. If you don't recognize this guy, he was one of the sports heroes of my childhood, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. He was the center for the Los Angeles Lakers. Played 20 years in the NBA. He was a 19-time All-Star, 6-time MVP, and 6-time NBA champion. When I was a teenager and Kareem was in his prime, it was like watching the offspring of a giraffe and a ballerina. He was graceful, intimidating, and unstoppable on the basketball court. But in 1989, I recall Kareem's last year in the NBA. I sat in the 6th row of the fabulous forum and watched as Magic Johnson, James Worthy, and the rest of the Showtime Lakers raced up and down the floor while Kareem lagged far behind. He played less and less, became the 4th scoring option on the team, as well as a liability on defense. Well, it just goes to show that in sports, and technology, and in life for that matter, resources that you once depended on can no longer do what you need them to do. Better options become available, and old reliable systems become too expensive to maintain. I bring up Kareem and reflect the parallel between his career, because he was indispensable to the 1980s Showtime Lakers, and to the technologies that I've used throughout my career. At one time or another, I would tell you that my most indispensable business productivity device was, well, a dual floppy PC, or then my trusty daisy wheel impact printer, or it was my original BlackBerry email device. I can remember why I made those investments in the first place, how they paid off for me and my company, and they were part of my everyday business productivity. They really were smart decisions. But would it be smart to keep using these resources today? I know it's difficult. It was for me when I put to rest my Amber Monitor 8088 PC, my external 10 megabyte hard drive, my first laser printer. That blasted out 2 pages a minute. And especially my original BlackBerry. I really missed that last one. But progress is inevitable. One day our kids are going to look at a picture of a fax machine like this on Wikipedia and ask, what was that for? Because to them, a fax machine like this will look as old as these forms of communication look to us. Hieroglyphics and Victrolas. They're amazing advancements for their time. 5,000 years ago, some Neanderthal got the notion to associate characters with meaning and chisel it on a rock. Thomas Edison invented the phonograph in 1877, recording sound using a needle in a rotating cylinder. What's really important to note here is that these things did not represent the invention of documents or music, and we certainly have documents and music today, but these inventions were responsible for incredible advancements in their day. Well, there's an interesting parallel between faxing document technology and musical devices, both of which were predicted dead long before their time. More than a decade ago, the media hailed email as the end of fax. Paper was bad, it was reasoned, and email would quickly drive faxes and other paper-based documents to their demise. But think about it. Wouldn't it have been ridiculous in 1980, by the way, the year Kareem won his second NBA championship, to suggest that music would be going away because 8-tracks and cassette tapes were being supplanted by CDs? We all know that in 1980, it wasn't music itself that was dying, just disco. And if I was brave enough to show you a picture of me in my white disco jean vest and disco jeans, you would agree that that happened not a moment too soon. But like the need for music, transmitting documents securely and quickly remains a critical business need. And like music, the devices used continue to evolve. Well, let's put these devices and the mediums they represent into a bit of time perspective. How many of you remember this scene from the movie Wall Street in 1987? It starred Michael Douglas and Charlie Sheen. Well, here, billionaire Gordon Gekko is using the latest mobile phone technology to explain to Bud Fox how the real financial world operates. Money never sleeps, pal. Well, when we saw this scene a quarter of a century ago, who among us would have guessed that what we were really looking at was the future of portable music? Well, as exactly no one predicted, the future of portable music didn't come from the Walkman, but instead from the mobile phone. And any futurist who says that they predicted this phenomenon is using revisionist history. Gordon Gekko's big brick mobile phone was a critical business tool, but it certainly wasn't a multitasker. And so it goes with fax. This same separation of media and devices applies to fax technology. Would you believe that the first thermographic fax was invented in 1846? That was more than 30 years before Edison invented the phonograph, and interestingly, 30 years before Alexander Graham Bell invented the first practical telephone. There was fax. Now, I suspect that most of these thermographic fax machines were put to pasture decades ago, but I could be wrong. In the late 1970s, fax machines became a mass market product. Every business had one. Remember thermal fax paper rolls? Do you know you can still buy those at Staples and Office Depot? But eventually their popularity waned. And in the 1990s, fax was incorporated into multifunction devices, peripherals for the network and the desktop. Plain paper faxing and all-in-one devices put fax in the department and eventually at our hands on the desktop. But people were still frustrated by this advancement. Dealing with paper jams, poor image quality, slow transmission times, and they expressed their frustration openly, as the workers in the movie Office Space demonstrated. Well, at the same time, on the corporate side, to handle high-volume enterprise faxing, dedicated fax servers, hardware and software, were placed in network server rooms, which centralized document rasterization and leveraged multiple phone lines, sometimes in a trunk structure. The model of one phone line, one fax machine, at least in the corporate world, became an obsolete model. Fax servers made some aspects of fax communication management much easier. They lowered the time consumption associated with faxing and reduced the number of paper documents hanging around the office. Well, at least for companies that could afford the large price tag associated with them. So, why am I suggesting that your fax servers may be the next obsolete technology that bogs down your organization? Well, VoIP, Voice over Internet Protocol, is the paradigm-changing technology. In the mid-2000s, VoIP went mainstream, meaning that digital voice quality was acceptable over the Internet. VoIP became the de facto standard for business telecommunications in companies large and small. The benefits included cost savings, easier administration, and global applicability. You didn't need a PBX or analog phone lines to make business telephone calls. Well, this change brought a new problem to fax. The need to attach fax boards directly to analog or even T1 telephone lines made VoIP deployment more complicated and expensive than it needed to be. Well, since its early mainstream usage, corporate fax has always been associated with telephony. Your company had a PBX system for managing calls and separated dedicated lines or trunks to transmit faxes. So, as VoIP came about, companies were faced with a choice. Leave the fax server as the only service still connected to legacy analog telephone lines, or move the fax server to the Internet as well, which required new gateways, new software, and new implementation services. So, in turn, fax server vendors needed to adjust, and so they developed VoIP, Fax over Internet Protocol, and adapted a new transmission standard, T38, to supplant the T30 analog fax standard, and to augment it as well. So the business could keep its server blades and software on site, but instead of being hooked up to multiple phone lines, fax would now be encrypted and digitized and sent over the internet. This is why they call it digital faxing. Well, it seems to many IT professionals that this would be the logical next step for their organization's fax communications. Telco lines gave way to VoIP, so analog fax lines should give way to FOIP. And while technically this may be correct, it's kind of like an SAT test answer. It's sort of right, but it's not the best answer. As it turns out, although there's nothing inherently flawed with the FOIP fax server model, it may just be the wrong delivery methodology today for most organizations to adopt. Now, to understand why, let's go back to our music example. Until very recently, it was logical for you to think that as the Walkman has evolved into the CD player and digital music storage further evolved to highly compressed formats so they could be played on MP3 devices, that the most popular model for portable music today would be the iPod and similar MP3 devices. They would be connected to the internet and serve as your dedicated device to download and listen to music. But of course, if you followed this logic, you would be wrong. You would know this if you had teenage daughters. Well, just like FOIP fax servers can send digital documents via the internet, MP3 players can service the need for portable music downloads from the internet. Yet, I have 2 iPods sitting in the back of my home office file cabinet, and they've been there for a couple of years. No, if you have teenage daughters like I do, you would know that the most popular way to enjoy music, and television and movies for that matter, is to have it delivered over the internet and to play it back on your smartphone. iTunes, Spotify, and Pandora are all the growing backbone applications of the music delivery industry. Gordon Gekko had it right, at least as it pertained to mobile phones. So similarly, fax has moved from a device that you buy and maintain to an internet-based subscription model where you simply pay for the service rather than for specialized equipment and software. And just as with music, with fax, the device itself is not as important as the service. With cloud-based faxing, you can send and receive faxes over email or through a web browser from your computer, tablet, or yes, even your smartphone. The paradigm shift here is not the device, it's the delivery. Remember, you don't purchase the music hardware and buy the music software. You subscribe to the music service and listen to it on any device that you like. This is the new model for hosted fax services. You don't buy fax server hardware and software and pay for the transmission lines. You subscribe to the cloud service. And while it's true the underlying technology between hosted fax services and FOIP servers is really the same, there are substantial differences when you look at how the service works and its benefits. Retiring your fax server gets you out of the fax management business and allows you to focus on core network administration responsibilities. Well, compare fax servers to hosted fax services. What's the difference? Well, with hosted fax services, there's no dedicated hardware or software, no papers needed, and there's no upfront investment or ongoing support and maintenance costs. Best of all, you only pay for the fax transmissions you actually use. So if you see your fax volume increase or decline over the next few years, you're not married to a technology investment that overwhelms its present-day value. Now, consider your current fax structure. Whether you're still using traditional standalone fax machines or fax servers, it might just be time to update your solution. As with all outdated technologies, fax machines and servers hold a number of hidden costs and productivity drains. Now, I'm not suggesting that if you use fax servers that you will look as outdated as this fellow. I'm just suggesting there might be a better solution available to you, and upgrading to it will be a lot less difficult than you might expect. So, I'd like to share with you 6 measurable self-evaluation questions you can ask yourself to help you get a better sense of your current fax needs and challenges and whether your organization would benefit from a cloud-based internet fax solution. First, how many faxes does your organization send each day? Fax volume often goes unmeasured by IT because the thinking is once the infrastructure is in place, the actual document flow goes unnoticed. That is, until fax traffic strains capacity of the servers. Fax servers require constant monitoring of system capacity and throughput to ensure that the solution is right-sized for your organization. While scaling up, adding lines, and adding servers can be slow and time-consuming, scaling back is even worse and is usually not an option. Just try returning a fax server to a vendor for a refund. Second question, is your fax volume constant or do you have peaks and valleys? Owning the equipment and infrastructure for faxing means that you need to purchase hardware and bandwidth that can accommodate your highest usage level. This isn't so much an issue if on a daily basis you have very small fluctuations in the number of faxes sent and received. In the real world, however, it's much more likely that you have peak usage periods where weekly or monthly reports are sent, invoices or statements, or incoming reports are due. Well, in this situation, you may have faxing overhead that's capable of a much higher volume, yet is severely underutilized when viewed as a whole. Next, do you have a backup plan for your server downtime? The adage, failing to plan is planning to fail, is familiar to IT directors. Even the most robust server infrastructures require scheduled maintenance and experience unexpected service outages. IT professionals build in contingencies for these service interruptions, usually through redundant servers, backup transmission lines, and the like. Of course, these contingencies incur costs and require resources of their own. For fax servers, it's advisable to have a backup server and a rerouting option for telephony issues, because faxes are often quite time-sensitive in business-critical transactions. If you don't have a backup plan with appropriate service outage contingencies, business-critical documents may be delayed or worse, go undelivered. Next, is your organization distributed? The golden age of fax servers occurred in the 1990s as companies were looking to centralize core services for easier management control and cost savings. Well, since then, most companies have seen a cloud model fits their business better. So if you have remote salespeople or work-from-home employees or multiple office locations, then having your fax servers in one location may not be the most efficient or the most reliable system for you. Fifth, is your telephony environment stable or dynamic? VoIP has changed telecommunications in corporate America. With the sound quality equal or exceeding equivalent analog networks, over 80% of companies have adopted VoIP for voice communications. Yet many of these same companies maintain telephony service just to support fax machines or servers. If you have already made the switch to VoIP, or if you're in the process of doing so, continuing to support an in-house fax server will mean maintaining otherwise unnecessary telephony costs. And finally, what is your cost each month for faxing? How much does it cost your company for each page that you send or receive? Well, it seems like a simple question, but most companies have no idea what that number is. The simple mathematics suggests that you take the total cost and divide it by the number of pages transmitted. Well, we've already discussed how tracking page volume is often unknown. Well, measuring the cost can be even more convoluted. There's hardware and software maintenance, electricity, telephone lines or IP gateways, and employee time for maintenance and management of the system. If you do a thorough analysis of all these numbers, you might be surprised to find that your actual cost per transmission is much higher than you would suspect. While with hosted fax services, this number is much easier to obtain and much easier to control. Well, think of answering these questions before you engage with your server vendor or with the cloud services solution. It's akin to doing your research before shopping for a car. You know your current situation, and that will prepare you to take an analytical approach to all the available solutions. And once you have that better understanding of the characteristics of your current fax environment, you'll have the basis to consider moving forward to a hosted fax solution. Now, implementation can be anywhere from a few minutes to a couple of days, depending on the features and integrations that you require. And the change can be completely transparent to your end users. Sending or receiving faxes can be initiated from the applications that they already use, including Microsoft Office or Outlook, or even from enterprise-wide systems like SAP. Hosted fax services can accommodate desktop faxing, which is typically individual transactions to and from users, production faxing, which is sending the same document to thousands of recipients simultaneously, and application faxing, which takes an API tied to an application, and that's used for sending and receiving customized templated documents to thousands of recipients. Well, there are many other features involved with hosted fax services that can be selected to accommodate transmission security, archiving needs, and even mobile devices. We will go into more detail of these decisions in future presentations. eFax Corporate also has several white papers and data sheets available to you to explain these features and benefits. Well, I hope this presentation gives you a bit of perspective on the changing model for fax servers. Please email me with any questions or observations that you may have. If you like help in reviewing your current fax environment, we'd be happy to help you with that. And if you'd like to share your own stories of technology obsolescence, I'd love to hear about those as well. And with that, I thank you for viewing this presentation and hope you have a great day.